I'd like to introduce Kay Westhughes. Kay is an artist and folklorist whose work is concerned with rural practices and places and encompasses the fields of photography, videography, audio, and ethnography. She is currently developing a website and traveling exhibition based on her oral history project about a roadside spring in Gary, Indiana, supported by Indiana Humanities, the Calumet Heritage Partnership, the Center for a Sustainable Future at IU South Bend, and the Environmental Studies program at St. Mary's College. Her video Water Catchers was included as part of Surface Tension, The Future of Water, an international traveling exhibition organized by the Science Gallery, Trinity College, Dublin. She's presented at several conferences on her folklore research on roadside springs, including the International Oral History Congress in Finland in 2018. Kay is an associate faculty member at the Ernestine M. Racklin School of the Arts, Indiana University South Bend, and an adjunct faculty member at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne. Please welcome Kay Westhughes.
Thank you, Julie. Can people hear me? Okay, so you hear me? Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to sit down while I talk to you. And I have a paper, but I promise you I'm not going to read it, but I use it to kind of keep track of dates. So thank you everyone for coming. And I really want to thank Julie and St. Mary's College for giving me this opportunity to show this work. It gave me a new deadline and a reason to create a lot more of it. So what I'd like to do today is really to just share with you what kept me interested. I've been working on this project since about 2010, and what keeps me interested in this topic for such a length of time, and what I've learned about water on the way. So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask, have any of you visited a spring or gathered water from a spring? Cool. Okay, so anyone want to share, a word or two that describe the experience or what you felt about going to a spring? Doubt? Doubt is in doubting the water is pure? Yep, I felt that before. Yes.
I felt like I was in on a secret.
Yes, I feel that way also, especially going to a spring that's not that well known and sort of hidden, and you find it as a sense of discovery. Yeah. Anyone else? If you haven't gotten water yourself, you might have seen someone along the side of the road getting water, as you're going by. And springs are interesting and been around for quite a long time. Indiana used to have hundreds of community springs. I'm going to refer to them as community springs. They're publicly accessed, meant to be publicly accessed. And these are a few that are nearby. Some springs, around the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, they were very popular. Sometimes they were park spaces where people would go and have picnics and just have their holiday. Sometimes they were roadside springs. The one below is a roadside spring where people will stop and get water when they're traveling. That was a really important thing because they didn't have, bottled water back then, right? This was really the time before a lot of municipal utilities. So water was really not taken for granted during that time because you pretty much were responsible for finding it yourself. The ad on the left here is a spring water that was bottled from the Black Oak area in Gary and Calumet Township, and it was bottled around the beginning of the 1900s and sold by a company called Hammond Pure Water Company. So Hammond Pure Water Company bought the rights to a number of springs in Porter and Lake County and sold that water because there was a lack of good water. So bottling spring water isn't really a new thing. It's been around for a while. And what I want to show you next is a bit of my research. So I've been researching springs since about 2010, and I found roughly 46 that are still running in the state. And this is a map it shows actually the bedrock aquifer system in Indiana and shows where the springs are related to that. And so you can see that there's a number of different bedrock aquifer systems in Indiana. And geologists define it by the type of rock that the water sits in. So it could be like sitting in limestone or sitting in shale. And those different rocks or minerals actually affect the minerals that are in the water. So your water is going to change depending on what aquifer that they're in. And so I found that really fascinating. And one of the questions I get a lot when I'm out talking to people at spring sites is, where does that water come from? What's going on under the ground? And at first, I had to do some research on that myself. I'm definitely not a geologist, but I found that these aquifers are really important, and they're not really. A lot of people kind of visualize it as an underground river. It's not really an underground river that moves like a river. But it is a holding place for water, and the rocks that the water's sitting in are sometimes very, very, very old, like glacier period or before old. So it's just a very interesting thing to imagine and try to conceptualize. And so that's what I was doing in these maps. And I also wanted to just tell some little narratives about each particular spring site, some things that I found kind of significant about the spring or something that happened to me. So they were really fun to make, and I'm going to make more. I've only made 2 so far, but they're just an effort for me to try to think about what's going on underneath the ground. So back to the spring sites. When I was researching the springs, there's basically 2 types of springs in Indiana. There are artesian wells and gravity-fed springs. And artesian wells are mostly in the central and northern part of the state. And they're a type of spring that bubbles up by itself without need to pump them. They're just kind of forced up to the surface because of the way the geology is. Gravity-fed springs kind of trickle down from a hill or a mountain or something like that, and they're found in the southern part of the state. But among the springs that I found, vast majority were artesian wells. And they could be lumped into 3 general categories, kind of. One is they're still around and they're still public springs. So these are examples of 2 that are still publicly accessed and publicly tested and provided to the public intentionally. So you might find them in a park. The Chase Street Spring is on it's on property that's managed by the Little Calumet River Basin Development Commission, overseen by the Corps of Engineers. And so it's public property, and it's tested on a quarterly basis. This one in Pittsburgh is also on public property, and it's tested on a monthly basis. So when you find a public spring, you know that water's being tested, and that's a good thing. For example, this one here in North Webster was the one we just saw on the postcard. It's not as scenic as it used to be, but it's still running, and it's still tested and used for water collection. And some of our state parks have artesian wells in them too. But another type of spring that I found were these kind of like informal, springs that were on private property, and they were in use so long for public collection that they're still used for public water collection. And they're kind of like vestiges of the public commons, which is like the 17th century European thing. The roots come from that period of time when people who did not have land, the landowners would allow them to come in and grow their food or cut down their firewood or what have you. So people, in order to sustain themselves, had to use the land, but they didn't own the land, right? The land was held in commons and people could use it. So these are kind of vestiges of the agricultural public commons, because they've been in public use for so long and people still use them, but they're not tested. It's up to you to test it. And so people who use them usually live in the area and have been using them for a while. And so both of these, the one on the left is near an agriculture area, and I really haven't tried that water because the last time I went there was a manure spreader coming up and down, and it's like, no, I'm not going to try that water. So you're kind of taking a risk when you try those private springs. Then I found another whole group of springs that don't run anymore at all. Or if they do run, the water isn't drinkable. And this is a spring near Jimerson Lake, which is in the eastern part of the state, and it runs kind of sporadically. But actually, today I got an email from someone telling me that it stopped running. So I don't think it's running anymore. But it's right next to a Tom's Donuts, and it's right, near all this really heavy development. And that's really what happens sometimes to these springs. The area gets built up. Sometimes the geology kind of gets, because of the building and digging them in, putting down foundations and roadways, the springs might shift and not run anymore. Sometimes pollution is an issue with runoff from nitrates and agriculture and stuff like that. So sometimes a new landowner will buy the spring and decide they don't want the liability and they'll close it. So there's lots of reasons, why they close. This is another abandoned roadside spring that's down the southwestern part of the state. So if you start to look, you'll find a lot of them, but not all of them are usable. So even though they're not used anymore, there's still this kind of fascination I found with gathering water from the spring. There's still a significant number of people who think that it's special. It's a special experience. And I don't know, has anyone ever seen this website, findaspring.com? It's a place where you can actually submit your own spring locations with a GPS, and then you could learn about where springs are, and it's all over the world. So if I wanted to go to the Czech Republic and find out where the springs were, I'd probably start here and look and see if anyone has posted springs. But I found the site. There's a big community, of spring lovers. But I find that the homepage is really symbolic somehow of our, kind of myths about spring water. There's this myth of, the forest that is this unknown place or mysterious place, in the sense of Western discovery. You have these two people, they're obviously a couple, and they're each holding their jug and they're ready to go off into the woods and find some water. It's just very, to me, that the story there, just in that one photo, tells a lot about, the way that we relate, I think, to nature sometimes. So when you're talking about springs, I found that besides just the, the practical reasons why you want spring water is important because of the way it makes people feel and the thoughts it inspires. So spring water and water in general, you've all heard the phrase water is life, right? Water is essential to life. And that gives water a terrific power in our cultural imagination, right? I mean, that's a very strong concept. And water takes a lot of different forms in our folklore and folk song and folk tales. For example, the whole idea of water being so strong that it could change a landform or eliminate a landform. I mean, that kind of symbolic, the power and the agency of nature, right? And it kind of shows us in water. So there's lots of really strong symbolic stuff in water in general, but even more so in springs. This is a spring that I photographed when I visited in Ireland. The one time I visited Ireland, I felt really happy to be able to go there and take a look at, and I did kind of a holy well trip where I visited a number of holy wells. Has anyone been to Ireland here? Has anyone visited a holy well? I see one, yes. They're amazing places. They're springs that are considered to have healing properties. They're places of prayer. They're places of petition. That some springs have special associations with special healing aspects. Like, for example, you might go to a certain spring because of your eyes. You want better health for your eyes. So they're very symbolic and predate Christianity. Springs are they're also considered, for example, a link between the upper and lower worlds, which I think is really symbolic for us as humans, because we disappear at some point. We go into another world, and what is that about? So spring is kind of, give us a way to imagine that. Also, the movement of water sometimes, we refer to as the flow of time. I mean, the movement of water helps us to imagine how time happens or how time flows. So there's a lot to water. And I find that just being at these springs, I get really inspired, and sometimes I don't want to leave them for a while. I love listening to them. I love being in the spaces, and I feel like that's part of the attraction of gathering water. I've met a lot of people in this project who are spring lovers, and sometimes people just go because they went with their family. It's a family thing that they did when they were kids. This family had brought their kids to the spring for the first time when I was taking these pictures. It was a nice coincidence meeting. But the father who isn't in the picture, he stops at that spring kind of regularly on his way home from work because the water's super cold. On the hot days, it's really nice to have that water. But yeah, so the kids were just having a great time sticking their head under the spring and cooling off. And also I find that a lot of times there's a sense of community among people who go to these springs. Like these two folks did not come together, but they knew each other because they probably met before at the spring, right? This spring is in Carmel, Indiana, and it's really popular, partly because it's so close to Indianapolis. But also it's been made into a public park, and it's also tested on a regular basis. And the results from the tests are posted on their park website, so you can see if there's a lot of nitrates, you might want to stay away for a while. That's kind of what some of these springs have issue with nitrates. I also found people wanting to visit these springs because of health reasons. A lot of times there's concerns about fluoride in water. I don't know if you've heard or talked with anyone who has concerns about fluoride in water, but that's one issue that I've heard. But there's also, and I'm going to look this up to make sure I pronounce it right, there's a byproduct of making Teflon. Is anyone familiar with that chemical? Pardon? PFAS, yes. There's a long scientific name for those though. And they are unregulated chemicals right now. They're not regulated in our water system. So there's nobody keeping track of how much, and they have been related to cancer, causing cancer. So there are things like that. Also, herbicides are in our water and they're not regulated. They're not counted. They're not, tracked at all. So there's things like that people are concerned about. And that's what leads them a lot of times to use that spring water. A lot of times people run it through filters. They also have met people that use spring water for spiritual reasons, and these are just two examples. Kendra and Ray, they were collecting water that they were going to use. She's a practice of a Wicca, and she uses spring water to make crystal water, which they use in a ceremony. And it has to be spring water. So she makes the trip to the spring to get that water on a semi-regular basis. And also, the use of municipal water can go against a religious belief that, limits your experience with modern things, right? I mean, if you don't use electricity, you're not going to be using water that's filtered by the use of electricity. So there's a lot of reasons why people might not want to use the municipal water. And these are just a few of them. Also, there are people, lastly, who use it out of necessity. And this is caused by a lot of reasons why people use spring water out of necessity. I mean, right now with Hurricane Ida, I just read this morning, there's no water in a good part of New Orleans right now where the hurricane affected electricity. People have to get their water somewhere else. When there was a lead crisis in East Chicago, people were going to the spring in Gary to get that water because the water in their apartments was not potable. Also, maybe you have an electric storm, a storm, and the electricity goes out in your house. So there's lots of reasons why people use it out of necessity, and that's a lot of work. Water weighs a lot, and it's a lot to pack. And there are people who use all of their water. All their water comes from spring water. So it's all very layered. What I start to learn about why these things still exist, because one of my research questions is, why are they still in the public commons? Why are they still being used? What's causing this to happen? And so that's partly why I started a oral history project on it, so I could learn that. I want to talk about one more aspect of springs, though, is that springs are have been contested places because they are places that are important to people, to existence. And so springs have been site of contestation or conflict. And this is an example of one spring in Independence, Indiana, that you can see here that the spring is actually marked on this 1877 atlas. Can you see the red circle around? It's called A Fine Spring. And this map shows it's the first survey map of the town of Independence. But just like, I think it was 40 years prior to that, the trial of death happened in Indiana, which I'm sure you've all heard about. It's when over 800 Potawatomis were forcibly removed from their villages and forced to walk over, 600 and long way, 600 and some miles. And many people lost their lives as a result. And this just happened, just not too long before this village was plotted, right? And the person who plotted the village was Zacharias Sikah. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right. I looked it up on the internet. And he was a trader in that area. And he actually supported the fight against Tecumseh's War in the War of 1812. So he was firmly in the side of the US. And as a result, he was awarded thousands of acres, which included that spring. So he actually, got that property, divided it up, and made, probably quite a profit off of planting that city of Independence. But I think it wouldn't have been as important if it didn't have that spring, right? So I visited the spring in 2010, and this is a photo of it. And to me, it looked like it was in a lot of disrepair. And I thought, nobody's really probably gathering water from it anymore. And then I usually talk to people when I'm hanging out at the springs, and I met this older guy. He was in his 80s. And he told me that the whole town at one time used that spring water. They had to depend on it because the bedrock on top of that spring was so deep that no one could drill a well. So that's why the spring was so pure. I mean, it had a good solid cap on it, but it also meant that they couldn't drill individual wells. And so everyone had to go down to that spring and tote water. He told a story about how he went with they strap like a 55-gallon drum on their headlights, and they go down and get their wash water. And, he told a little bit about what that experience was like. It was a lot of work. Again, hauling water is a lot of work. So, he told me about that. And he said that in the 70s, him and a few other people laid all the section lines, and they piped that spring into the village. So the houses in the spring, the houses in the village were getting water from that spring when I was there in 2010. So they were all using that spring water. When I visited back in 2021, I met one person who was getting water in his house still from the spring, but he thought maybe there were just a few people left that did that. Most people had hooked into municipal water by then. But I just feel like that's an interesting story. It kind of tells a little bit about how, we take these springs sort of for granted as being there for us, but they, we a lot of times claim them, right? Took them. So the last spring I want to talk about, and I'm sorry I'm not talking about my art practice as much as I'm talking about the springs. I hope that's okay with you all. I feel like there's so many good stories and things to learn about the springs. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the oral history project that I worked on. And that was on, I spent a lot of time at this spring over the last few years. It's on Chase Street in Gary. And it's known as the Chase Street Spring or the Chase Street Well. I've gotten to call it the spring at Small Farms because it supported a community called Small Farms. But here is a map so you can kind of see where the spring is at. You can see IU Northwest on there. It's not too far from IU Northwest. I've made the trip with a few of you guys in here to that spring already. But yeah, it's on Chase Street. And it supported for about 3 decades, really. It supported residents who lived in Black Oak, which you can see on the map, and also a community called Small Farms, which was both north and south of 94, kind of in that area where there's not a lot of streets, right? Because right now it's been kind of turned back into, it was built on very low ground, and it's kind of turning back into a marsh. When you talk about small farms, it was settled during the Great Migration. primarily by African American small farmers, and so there was a lot of farms in that area. People kept animals and raised their own food, and then Black Oak was just a little to the west of that. So those two communities didn't have municipal water. In the 50s, the area didn't have street lights or paved roads. It was pretty rural, and people had to depend on their own wells. They dug their own wells, and they used a different aquifer than what the spring was pulling from. There was like a shallower, unconfined aquifer that was really easily polluted, and so people were having problems. Their springs, their wells were going bad, right? And so also the water was really rusty and it stained clothing and stuff like that. So people had to start going to the spring to get their water. I don't know how people first heard of it. I've heard like 3 different people piped it originally. So I don't know who actually did pipe it originally, but I've got 3 origin stories so far on the spring, and maybe I'll get more, I don't know. But yeah, around the 30s, I think it's when it was first piped. So this is what Chase Street looks like now and the spring looks like now. And the area's been kind of turned back in, like I said, to a natural area. It's used for flood control along the Little Calumet. The spring's only about a mile from the Little Calumet River. This is the way when I first visited the spring, I didn't know anything about the spring, right? I was just like, what is this place? I didn't even know it. At the time, actually, to be honest, when I first started this project, I didn't think anywhere in Indiana was safe to get water from the ground. I learned differently because when growing up on a farm and the use of pesticides and herbicides on the farm, I didn't think any water source was safe to drink. But I did learn that's not the case, which is a good thing. But yeah, so Chase Street looked like this when I first visited it. And it's on a dead end road, so it's been used for illegal dumping for years now. And it's it's a problem that Gary has because of their lack of tax base. They didn't have a good, they couldn't fully respond to all the people who were dumping in Gary. And Gary, the population was also, lowered. So there are lots of places where there weren't a lot of people to check that out. Are you getting feedback from me? I hope not there. So yeah, that dumping was a big problem at the spring. And so several times since I've been involved in it, there's been cleanups, but it just eventually gets back to this state. So in my quest to kind of understand what was going on with the spring, I started this oral history project. And I did that with the support of Indiana Humanities and the Calumet Heritage Partnership. St. Mary's also helped. They helped with an intern that I worked with for the first semester, which was great. She helped me with my interviews. And then I also work with 2. I'm now working currently with 1 intern at IU, and I had another one before COVID or during the time of COVID. But so we talked a lot about all the people that I talked with were Gary residents, and some of them use the spring personally. Some of them just saw people, like their family members use the spring, but they didn't care for the water. Some people were associated with the spring in some way, but everyone was a resident of Gary. About 80% of the people were over 50. So I talked to a lot of older people, 21 people total I interviewed for the project. And I thought maybe I'd just share a few guys. I didn't test the sound first. So if sound doesn't work, you can read because I also put the quote on here. But I have a few sound bites from interviews that you guys might illuminate a little bit how people use that spring. So I'm going to see if I can get this to play.
Nice, clean, cold water. It was always very cold, and it's all I ever knew growing up. I didn't know anything other than that. I didn't know that everybody didn't go to the well when I was a kid because there were always a lot of people there. You go, you have to wait your turn, or you go down a little hill and get your water, and there was always somebody else waiting to go after you finished.
So there was a lot of pride. There's a lot of pride in small farms in general, I find, but there was a lot of pride in that spring. And it was really good to hear different people's stories. One person compared it to Perrier. It was their Perrier water. Another person compared it to the Song of Bernadette. I don't know if anyone's watched that movie where there's a spring, a miraculous spring that comes up. She said when she was a child, she always felt like she was in the movie when she went to the spring. So there's a lot of cool memories that people shared, but it wasn't all positive. not having water can be a stigma. It definitely is a hardship. And some people were there because they didn't want to be there. So I'm going to share one other interview with an alternate kind of viewpoint. And this is Ida Lloyd, who moved to small farms as a child. She was, I think, 11 or 12 years old. And she moved from East Chicago, which is a very urban, integrated place. And small farms was pretty segregated and definitely rural. So she felt like her mom was punishing her when she, moved there. She did not enjoy it at all. And she talked a bit about what it was like as a child having to go get that water.
In the wintertime, your pumps would freeze up. So we had to go take our buckets and not just the buckets, but jugs of water. We had to take jugs over to the spring, which the water never froze. It was always coming up. Someone had put a pipe down it after a while. And let it come up through the pipes like you got a pump. But you didn't have to pump, it was just constantly flowing. And we would take our utensils there to get the water. So then you had to carry it back, and my mother didn't drive, and we had to wait till someone in the area was free to take us there with our buckets and our jars and our gallons, the milk gallons. But it was something else. Yeah. But it never froze, and you can meet your neighbors there.
Well, there was definitely a community that you would see, and actually those two communities, Black Oak and Small Farms, they were sort of segregated at that time. But the communities would meet at the spring, which I thought was also an interesting thing that happened. The high schools were the other places where the communities met, the schools. But why was this happening? It was happening because these communities were like kind of they were neglected by the county, by Calumet Township. And in 1966, there was actually a protest downtown Gary in front of the city hall. They also went to the water company, the Gary Hobart Water Corporation, and they took some of the water from their wells that were bad, and they dumped that water on the steps of the city hall. And at the time, the mayor in Gary was Mayor Katz, and he promised they would get water. It took over 20 years after this protest before people really started getting water in the small farms in Black Oak for a number of reasons, which I'm not going to go into in this presentation, but just people without a lot of economic power sometimes have a lot of problems getting things to happen, right? So that's what happened there in small farms. So this is a kind of what it's been looking like off and on. I hate to show this one, but I have a lot of pictures like this because especially in the spring when the snow starts to thaw, there's a lot of trash. What happens sometimes, in addition to the dumping, you know that a spring is used because there's going to be a lot of plastic bottles, because if you lose your cap, then you just toss the plastic bottle sometimes and don't take it home with you. And so if you see a lot of plastic bottles around the spring, you know it's being used. So I did know it was being used. But during this oral history project, I was fortunate enough to meet members and get involved with members of the Gary Food Council. And they are an organization, nonprofit, and they focus on food security issues in Gary. They start a lot of urban farming projects, and they do lessons. They do a lot of work with urban farming. And they decided to make the spring one of their projects, and they were hoping to get the spring tested more regularly, get it repiped, make it safer, put some lighting out there, and somehow keep the dumping from happening. So one thing that they did this year, on Martin Luther King Day, we did a cleanup at the spring, and it was great. We had over 20, Dave was there, and also Carol was there. We had over 25 people at that cleanup. I'm not sure how many people we had. It was very, very cold weather. I mean, it was freezing cold weather. So we had a very good turnout. The deputy mayor, Gary, came as well, which was really, and a lot of the commission members came. And we cleaned up the spring. It looked great. But now it's kind of slipping back into it did have a hot tub when we were there. So the hot tub is gone. But some other things probably have arrived. But the good thing about this, and at that cleanup, the Little Calumet River Basin Commission announced plans for a park that they're going to create around the spring. So yeah, actually David Castellanos is with us today, who is one of the board members. He's like one of the Gary board members of the Little Calumet River Basin. Yeah, Shana was there too at that keynote at the Little Calumet River Basin Commission. And maybe you want to share some information. Would you mind sharing some information about what's going on with the park? Because I haven't been to the last meeting. I don't really know what's going on with the park.
Okay, first of all, I want to compliment you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you, David.
Definitely show that count. Good job.
Okay, cool.
I will tell you one thing that because of Kate's involvement with the commission, and it's been a number of years, we have now decided to fund this spring, and we're going to have our first pre-bid walkthrough next week, and it's going to go into construction starting in May and October, and we intend to make it probably one of the most excellent, one of the best springs for the state, not just for the state, but also for all of North Virginia. And this was we were able to get this done with Kay's help. So Kay, you can see very awesome.
It took a lot of people to get this to happen, but I love the plan. The plan is, see, one of the issues is it's so in the wintertime dangerous to get water there, and so they've got this plan where kind of like this cul-de-sac where you drive in, park, you sit on kind of like this nice little wall, get your water, and drive out. So I mean, I just think it's a really cool plan, and I'm so excited. I didn't know for sure when it was happening because it was held up for a little while. Lots of stuff going on, but it's happening now, so that's very exciting. And yeah, and I think one of the things that the Food Council and also David really forefronted is that this spring has to continue to be useful to people who need it. That's like the priority of it, right? So that's what we hope will happen. So yeah, thank you for that, David.
And also we want to thank you because we got people from Illinois. There's a guy over there that came over there with a truck and a big container of Joliet. He was filling up the water. So the word is getting out.
Yeah,
so we might have to start charging.
Yeah, I actually met someone who had a power washing business that was getting his water from the spring. Yes.
Are there people in Gary still who need to use, need as they don't have city water?
Oh yeah, there are still some people that are off that use their wells, but not as many. In 2000, I think it was 2000 was the last time they did a lot of upgrading and putting in water. I think people use it more either because they prefer it or they need it. That's two different reasons. But would you say that, David? You talked to a lot of people out there that get that water.
Right. Well, people come there every day with water, and we had more than 25 people, actually about 50 people.
Yeah, I tried to count them in my mind.
We had sanitary district out there. We had people from various communities, and people from Calumet and Chicago. It helped them out a lot because there was a toxic site a couple blocks from where that Calumet facility was for people who lived for years.
Yes.
And it was found to be very toxic and it flowed over into that community.
Yes.
And it emptied out that whole community. In fact, we have maybe around about 200 families that had moved from that facility into that. And so that's what.
Yeah, you see that area with no streets that we saw earlier. That was the area. Yeah.
And we have people right now who say that they have municipal properties for them, and they don't drink any other water besides their water. So that's just it.
There's some definitely spring lovers, definitely. So yeah, thank you for that. So I mean, I'm really excited that it's moving along. And I guess that's pretty much. I mean, I know I didn't talk too much about my artwork that much. I made that water table because I wanted people to think about water and to think about it in terms of different ways of framing it. You think about water as a commodity, you buy water and not, right? Or you think about water as a resource, which I don't like that so much because it's like you're using it. I like to think of it more as a gift. It's a gift that's provided to us. And I think with that kind of framework, we can really start to appreciate and acknowledge what it is and keep it for our future generations. So that's pretty much how I'm going to end my talk. So thank you all for listening. You are the wonderful people that help support the project and the interns that I worked with. Does anybody have any questions?
I will be interested in seeing how all of this research, in one way or another, will find its way into the artwork also. I'm sure that it will impact your work in one way or another, or it's doing it as I speak and developing a whole new body of work.
It's still percolating in there, Dora. Yeah, what to, there's a lot of layers, and so especially this oral history project. So yeah, I'm definitely thinking about how I want to talk about that and art, which I haven't really done yet. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Shana?
Yeah, on Martin Luther King Day, there was a former graduate of IUSC there who was talking about possibly making an urban garden. Have you heard anything about that?
Right now, we at Mission, we're gonna get this project here out the way first.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna move on to the next project. We're working with FEMA right now on some projects for that land. So, it's right up to the main thing. We want to get this one here out the way. Once we get it done, then we move on to the next project.
Terry?
I thought it was wonderful that you had the water and your folklore for what you all interviews and just the wells is very much integrated into the art exhibition. Because some of those frames have a little kind of relic inside your frame.
That's
There's a little vial of water from that well. And then also you have the table that has bottles found in the different wells with water in them. And the most amazing thing about it for me, how the water interacts with your art, were the two maps that are watercolor and oceans and spring water.
I use the spring water,
So
yeah,
like
for the water.
It made it like, that's how you think kind of like a watercolor look to it.
Mhm.
I think that's amazing. And I think it's very integrated in a synthesis of art, folklore, and human beings and history.
Cool. I really tried to think of a way to bring water into that exhibit in some kind of way. So thanks for that. I appreciate that. Really. Anyone else? Guys, thank you. I appreciate you for sticking with me.